It was the kind of storm that made the world outside seem like a distant memory, dark clouds swirling above, wind howling like the desperate cries of a lost soul, and rain coming down in sheets, soaking everything in its path. The ranch house sat alone on the edge of the plains, its timbers creaking and groaning under the weight of the tempest. Inside, Clara Montgomery stood by the window, watching the fury of nature, but her mind was far from the storm outside. The widow had lived alone for nearly 2 years since the death of her husband, and in that time the loneliness had gnawed at her deeper than any wound could. But Clara wasn't the kind of woman to let herself fall into despair. The land demanded respect, and it didn't care about your heartache. The horses needed tending, the cattle needed feeding, and the chores would never cease. She had learned to live with it, carving a place for herself in a world that often seemed indifferent to a woman alone. But tonight was different. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and she swore she heard the sound of hooves pounding the earth outside, a lone rider cutting through the storm. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. "Just your mind playing tricks," she murmured, turning away from the window. But the sound grew louder. Her heart skipped a beat. Someone was out there. She moved quickly to the door, her boots scraping the wooden floor. Grabbing the lantern by the door, she swung it open, the gust of wind nearly tearing it from her hand. The porch was empty, but the air smelled thick with the promise of something. And then, out of the darkened sky, a figure emerged, riding fast through the sheets of rain. The horse, a black stallion with wild eyes, came to a sudden stop in front of her, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. The rider was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of his worn hat. His clothes were soaked, but there was something about his presence that demanded attention. "Ma'am," he called, his voice low and rough, like gravel being ground beneath a boot. "I need shelter, just for a few hours. I'll be gone by morning." Clara hesitated. She'd learned long ago to trust no one, especially men who appeared out of nowhere in the middle of a storm. But something about him, the way he sat upright in the saddle with quiet strength, made her pause. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the deep shadows beneath them, and though it was dark, she could feel his unease. "I don't have much to offer," she said, her voice steady, despite the tension that knotted in her stomach. "But you can come in, just for tonight. We'll see about the rest, come morning." The man nodded, his movements stiff, and swung off the horse. As he approached, she saw the faintest limp in his step, a sign of injury that hadn't fully healed. He wasn't just running from the storm, he was running from something else, something far darker. She led him inside, the heat of the fire greeting them both as they entered the warmth of the small house. Clara set the lantern on the table and gestured toward the chair near the hearth. "Sit," she instructed, watching him carefully as he sank into the chair, his long coat heavy with water. She busied herself with pouring a mug of coffee, trying to push aside the suspicion rising in her chest. There was something about him, something he wasn't saying. But Clara had learned to trust her instincts. She'd survive this night, but there was no telling what would happen when morning came. The man didn't speak for a long while, staring into the flames. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice soft, but full of quiet intensity. "I didn't mean to bring this storm to your door, Miss Montgomery," he said, his words deliberate, as though he was carefully choosing each one. "I've been running for a long time." Clara's brow furrowed. The name was familiar, but she couldn't place it. "Running from what?" she asked before she could stop herself. The man looked at her, his eyes cold and distant. "From my past." Her pulse quickened, but she nodded, offering him the warmth of a silent understanding. There were no more questions that needed to be asked, not yet. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this man, with his haunted eyes and hidden secrets, was about to change everything. The storm raged outside, but inside, the crackling fire offered a strange warmth that seemed to push away more than just the chill of the night. Clara watched the man closely as he sat near the hearth, his face half hidden in shadows. He hadn't spoken much since he entered the house, only taking the coffee she had offered him and staring into the flames with an intensity that made her feel as though he was looking for something, perhaps even something in her. She sat across from him, the heavy silence between them growing thicker with each passing minute. Finally, unable to endure the tension any longer, Clara broke the quiet. "What happened to your leg?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended, betraying a trace of concern. The man didn't look up at first. He just ran his hand over his damp hair, pushing it back from his forehead before finally meeting her gaze. His eyes, though tired, were full of an unspoken storm that seemed to mirror the one outside. "It's not something I like to talk about," he said, his voice rough as though the words were hard for him to speak. He paused, his lips pressing together tightly before continuing. "But I reckon I owe you an answer, seeing as you've let me into your home." Clara didn't respond, but she did lean forward slightly, her curiosity overtaking her better judgment. She had seen enough in her years on the frontier to know when a man was hiding something, and the weight of his silence was more telling than any words he could have spoken. "The name's Jack Travers," he began, his eyes distant again, lost in a memory. "I used to work for a lawman, a man named Sheridan. He was a good man, but we were chasing a gang of outlaws. They killed my partner, and I took a bullet for my trouble." He paused, looking down at his leg briefly as if the scar of it was something he could still feel. "The wound got infected, and by the time I was able to patch it up myself, I was already too far behind. I spent the next year hunting them down, but I never did find the bastards responsible." Clara's heart tightened. There was something in the way he spoke that told her the past wasn't something he had come to terms with. "Why are you still running, Jack?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had seen enough men like him, the kind that couldn't leave the past behind, the ones who lived as though there was no way out of the mistakes they'd made. Jack's eyes flickered to hers, and for a moment Clara thought he might pull away from the question. But then he sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. "Because I'm not the same man I was," he admitted. "And the past, well, it's a lot harder to outrun than you might think." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Clara found herself wondering if she had any right to press further, but her heart, always too quick to feel, urged her to push, to understand the man sitting across from her. "And what about now?" she asked quietly. "What are you running from, if not them?" Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he was measuring her words. For a long while he didn't respond, and the fire crackled in the silence. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "From myself," he said, the weight of those two words making Clara's chest tighten. "I've done things I can't take back. Things that are far worse than any bullet wound." Her breath caught in her throat. There was a vulnerability in his admission, an honesty that wasn't often seen on the frontier. It made her question everything she thought she knew about him. For the first time since he had arrived, she saw him not as the stranger who appeared in the storm, but as a man, flawed but undeniably human. The room was heavy with his confession, and Clara could feel her heart shifting, breaking open just a little bit. She knew better than to ask more questions. The storm outside seemed like the least of their worries now. Jack reached for the coffee cup, his fingers brushing against the mug as though the contact was something to steady himself. But then, just as Clara thought he might withdraw again, he looked at her, his eyes softening ever so slightly. "You don't have to believe me," he said quietly, "but I never meant to hurt anyone, and I certainly didn't mean to show up at your door like this. I'm just trying to find some peace in this life." Clara didn't know what to say. She had lived long enough in the wilderness to know that words weren't always necessary. Sometimes it was the silence that spoke the loudest. She nodded slowly, trying to offer him some kind of comfort in the only way she knew how. "Peace is a hard thing to find out here," she said, her voice steady despite the pull she felt toward him. "But sometimes it's not the finding that matters, it's the journey." Jack looked at her, his eyes narrowing as though the weight of her words had struck something deep inside him. For the first time, the storm outside seemed less like a force of nature and more like the reflection of their own inner turmoil. Two souls caught in the wind, both searching for something they couldn't quite grasp. The days that followed the storm were filled with a strange sense of tension and unspoken understanding. Clara had offered Jack shelter without question, but the space between them seemed to grow with every passing moment. The weight of his past was a constant shadow, lurking just behind his every word and action. He was grateful, yes, but it was clear that something still held him back. Clara, too, felt the pull of her own solitude, her life of quiet strength, her fiercely guarded heart. She had lost so much, yet had never let the world break her. But Jack, with his haunted eyes and painful past, stirred something within her. It was as if his presence both terrified and comforted her at once. For days, Jack worked alongside her on the ranch, chopping wood, mending fences, and even helping to wrangle a stubborn cow or two. Yet the deeper connection they had begun to form was fragile, like the delicate threads of a spider's web, easily torn by the weight of their pasts. One evening, as the sun began to set, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the property, her gaze lost in the vastness of the plains. The colors of the sky stretched before her, fiery oranges and soft purples blending together like the distant memories of a lifelong past. The wind tugged at her hair, and for a moment she thought of her husband, of the life she had once known before it all came crashing down. "Don't think about it," she whispered to herself, shaking her head as if trying to clear the thought. But just as quickly as it appeared, the memory faded, replaced by the deep voice of Jack calling her name from behind. Clara turned, surprised to see him standing a few paces away, his expression unreadable. "I was just finishing up with the horses," he said, stepping closer. His hands were rough with calluses, his shirt damp from the sweat of the day's labor. "Thought you might want some company." She nodded, but there was something in his tone, something beneath his words that felt too heavy. She felt it again, the weight of the unspoken things between them. They had danced around it long enough, hadn't they? "I could use a break," she said, her voice steady, but her mind racing. She stepped away from the fence and motioned for him to join her. "You've been working hard. You should sit down." Jack hesitated, then walked over, standing beside her as they both stared out across the vast horizon. The silence between them was comfortable in a way, but Clara could feel his eyes on her, studying her, as though searching for something. She couldn't keep it inside any longer. "Jack," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the fading light of the sky. "You don't have to keep running from your past. I can see it in your eyes every time you look at me. Whatever it is, it's holding you back." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, Clara thought he might walk away, retreat into the same shadows he had hidden in before, but instead he sighed deeply and lowered his gaze. "I don't know if I can," he said, his voice rough with a vulnerability Clara hadn't expected. "I don't know if I deserve to be anything more than the man I've become." Clara's heart ached. She had heard that before, from men who had lost themselves in their own mistakes. But there was something different about Jack, something that told her there was still goodness buried deep inside him, even if he couldn't see it himself. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said, turning to face him fully. Her eyes locked with his, and for the first time, she saw him. the real man beneath the armor he had built around himself. Whatever you've done, whatever you think you deserve, it doesn't define you. It's what you choose to do now that matters. Jack looked at her, his chest rising and falling with every breath. There was a storm in his eyes, but there was something else there too, a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. "I don't know if I can change," he whispered, his voice tight. "But I want to try." Clara reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm, feeling the tremor in his muscles as though he was ready to pull away. But she held firm, her touch steady and warm, a promise in her gesture. "You don't have to do it alone," she repeated, her voice strong but gentle. "We all have our demons, Jack. The difference is whether we choose to face them or let them control us." The silence that followed was thick with emotions neither of them had fully voiced. But for the first time in a long time, Jack didn't look away. He didn't hide behind his walls. He stood there, with Clara beside him, as if the weight of his past was just a little bit lighter. The evening stretched on, the sky darkening into twilight as the two of them stood together in silence. No more words were needed. The moment was enough. But as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Clara couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of something new? Or was it just another fleeting moment in the storm that both of them had been running from? The morning after their quiet conversation, the storm had passed. The sky was clear and the air was still, the lingering mist from the night before hanging in the air like a memory. Clara awoke to the soft sounds of the world, beginning anew, the birds chirping outside the window, the breeze rustling through the leaves. It was a peaceful morning, but there was a restlessness in the air, a sense that something had shifted. Clara pulled on her boots and made her way downstairs. The ranch was still as she left it the night before, but there was something different in the way the sunlight streamed through the windows, as though the world had been washed clean by the storm. As she stepped out onto the porch, the first thing she noticed was Jack. He was already out by the barn, his broad shoulders hunched over as he worked on the horses, his movements focused but slower than usual. Clara's heart fluttered at the sight of him. The man who had been a stranger, a shadow, was now something else, a presence in her life she hadn't fully prepared for. She hesitated, watching him for a moment longer. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, she walked toward him. The soft thud of her boots against the earth was the only sound between them as she approached. "Morning," she called out softly, her voice carrying through the quiet. Jack didn't look up immediately. He continued brushing down the horses, his face set in that familiar, unreadable expression. But when he did glance up, his eyes softened as they met hers, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Morning," he replied, his voice rough but warmer than it had been before. "I thought I'd get a head start on the work." Clara smiled, though there was a knot of unease in her stomach. The past few days had been filled with small, unspoken moments, shared glances, subtle touches, but this, the feeling that something was changing between them, left her uncertain. She had lived her life alone, and now, with Jack here, with all the layers of his past weighing him down, she couldn't help but wonder if she was ready for what might come next. "I'm not sure that's necessary," Clara said, her tone light, but her heart was racing. "I've been managing just fine on my own, but if you want to keep busy, I won't stop you." Jack laughed softly, a sound that felt almost foreign coming from him. "I'm not doing it to keep busy," he said, his eyes glinting with something unspoken. "I'm doing it because I want to, and I want to help." There was a shift in his words, a subtle but clear change. Clara felt it. It wasn't just gratitude or obligation. He truly wanted to be here, to stay. She nodded, walking over to him and reaching out to take the brush from his hand. "Well, if you're going to stay," she said, "I suppose we can work together." The words hung in the air, more significant than they seemed. Jack's eyes flickered to hers, his chest rising and falling with a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Together," he repeated softly, as though testing the word on his tongue. Clara smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, and began brushing down the other horse beside him. They worked in companionable silence, the rhythm of their movements somehow synchronizing as if they had always been meant to work side by side. As the morning wore on, they moved from task to task, the bond between them slowly building, one small gesture at a time. But even as they worked, Clara couldn't help but feel that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. By late afternoon, they stood on the porch together, gazing out over the land. The sun was beginning to set again, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. The ranch was quiet now, the animals fed and the chores done. Jack shifted beside her, his hand brushing against hers, and she felt the heat of his touch, subtle but undeniable. "Clara," he began, his voice low and careful as though testing the waters. "I know I haven't given you many reasons to trust me, but I meant what I said. I want to try. I want to make a life out here with you, if you'll have me." Clara's heart skipped a beat. The words she had longed to hear for so long were finally being spoken, and yet there was a hesitation in her chest, a small voice reminding her of the past, of the heartaches that came with loving someone who had so much darkness within them. But then she looked at Jack, really looked at him, at the man who had carried his burdens for so long, the man who had allowed himself to open up, even if just a little. "I think," Clara said softly, "we both have a lot of healing to do. But maybe it's worth the risk. Maybe we can find something here, together." Jack's face softened, the hardness of the past momentarily slipping away. He reached out, taking her hand in his grip firm yet gentle. "I don't know if I deserve you, Clara," he said, his voice hoarse, "but I'll spend the rest of my days trying to prove that I do." And in that moment, Clara knew. They had both been running, Jack from his past and Clara from the pain of losing everything she had known. But together they had found something stronger than their fears, something that could hold them together as they faced whatever came next. The storm had passed, and though they both still carried the scars of their pasts, they now had a chance to build something new, something worth fighting for. As the last light of day slipped away, Clara turned to Jack, her heart lighter than it had ever been. "Tomorrow is a new day," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Jack squeezed her hand, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "And tomorrow, we'll face it together."